No one truly lives history. They live their individual lives surrounded by relative complexities of other lives, other environments, a relative momentum of extended intensities. History is made up of collective mnemonic documents and diverse methodologies that reside only in the historian's mind and grasp when available in refined bits and pieces by others who take the time for study or amusement to drink from someone else's cup. 40 years ago, when I was a much younger man, a piece of history took place in Ontario, Canada, actually in a place so distant from the general reality of the times that it should have had little or no consequence. The only reason I know about it was because I was there at the time and near enough to that place. It drew me in. In fact, it sought me out in a kind of mutual attraction, and I became one of the principal characters in a story that has become many things to many people. The story of Ardoch has become mythological in nature, and while it may pass with this or the next generation, it will continue to repeat itself. In this retrospective is only a place, the events a space and time, but the function, a classical expression of eternal mythology. The Amjianong Reserve at Sarnia, Ontario, has been fighting a losing battle with the province of Ontario, nation of Canada, and their neighbors who are employed by the industry. They are surrounded by the petrochemical manufacturers and experience a tremendous amount of ill health effects because of the emissions and the pollution that comes from the industry. Even their cemetery is surrounded by petrochemical companies. They have not been successful, although the people of Amjianong continue to fight. They continue to press for help from the general public, the governments themselves, and even the industry. They continue to fight because this is their home. Amjianong is the place where people meet besides the fast water. The story of the Rice War at Ardoch turns out differently, and it is just as important to look at why a small Algonquin community could succeed in preserving what is sacred to them, even though it happened 40 years ago. Ardoch is located along the Mississippi River in eastern Ontario. It is located in an impoverished area that is sometimes referred to as the Canadian Ozarks. At the turn of the 20th century, the region had 4 times the population that it does today. It is sometimes also said that anybody who had any get up and go got up and left. The truth is, the settlement boom of the 19th century came and went, and rural eastern Ontario hill country just settled into a long period of day in and day out stability, and made do with what was left over while the rest of the world went on. At the time of the Rice War, people didn't have computers or cell phones. In fact, most neighbors shared a 4-party line phone, where if one family was on the phone, the neighbors could quietly pick up their phone and listen in. Everyone waved as they passed on the road because everyone knew each other, and the main entertainment for settlers and Indians was Friday and Saturday night dances with local musicians. The Mississippi River below Ardoch widens into what is called Mud Lake, where 3 substantial beds of wild rice grow throughout the summer and ripen in late August and early September. A gravel road runs alongside Mud Lake, connecting Ardoch and the village of Ampa, which lies to the northeast. The rice thrives in no more than a meter of water, and its main competitors are lily pads, arrowheads, and pickerelweed. As the river passes the rice filters the water. In the midsummer, it reaches the surface in what we call the floating leaf stage. Later, it will raise stalks that carry the developing seed heads. Monoman, or wild rice, is not really a rice. It is in the grass family. The seeds, when ripe, are heavier than water, shaped like torpedoes to descend quickly, and they are guided by the tail. They land head down in the river bottom. The seed heads have barbed cilia, which helps the seed burrow into the mud as the current moves the tail. The seed is also adapted a variable germination rate over a period of 1 to 7 years. In this way, wild rice has assured regeneration, even after a bad year in which floods or drought spoil the ripening period. The wild rice is a keystone species in a very complex ecosystem. Here's a film clip I made about 10 years ago. And if you look way down there, you'll see the second bed. The river's full of life. Already we've seen an osprey do some fishing. We've seen a flock of a couple of dozen geese feeding on the rice, as well as a number of ducks. Going through the river here, we've seen some turtles, frogs, we've seen some fish moving in the water. It's really just full of life here. This particular spot is a real favorite of mine, and I had my first encounter with a bear right here. This was a long time ago, and I still like to stop here and have a bit of a snack before I get down to the second bed to do some ricing. All right, well, we're in a pretty good stand of rice right now in the second bed, and this is how it's done. You pull it in with the sticks and you thrash it off. Pretty hard work for the guy who's pulling a canoe through the rice. That's my son River, but he wants me to take a picture of him later so you can see who he is. He really has the hard job right now. You got to pull through just at the right speed so that the thrasher, that's a little too fast, Riv. Slow down a little bit, so that the thrasher can knock it off. You don't miss much. Some of it ends up going back into the lake when you thrash it off, and that's good because it'll reseed itself. All right. Now let's go straight ahead, Riv, up to the next thicket. That's all right. Leave that out. Yeah. To understand the deeper context of the Rice War, it is important to look at the history of the human populations at Ardoch. The settlers began arriving by river in the 1850s, and settlement roads from Kingston reached the area by the 1860s. Lowland areas along the Ottawa River and the lower Mississippi had experienced settlement earlier. Many Indian people came upriver to find unsettled areas where they could live traditional lifestyles. and they were only displaced again by immigrant settlers looking for their own piece of the forest. By the turn of the 20th century, a modest number of farms were established. Multiple generation families were common, and each person knew how to do just about every job on the farm, as well as in the bush, and even in the distant labor camps, where men often spent the winter logging and mining for the extra cash needed to meet basic needs of existence. Ardoch itself had 3 mills working and a population of 400 itinerant laborers. 3 generations after they had arrived, some families had become well established, while others had packed up and moved west or to the growing cities along Lake Ontario. Other families continued to subsist and struggle as early settlers had. The Ardoch area has been inhabited by humans since it stood at the base of the retreating Ice Age glaciers some 12,000 years ago. Anthropologists estimate that the modern Algonquin cultural complex can be identified as existing 7,000 years ago. The stability of this cultural inheritance signifies a stable evolution of the physical environment. When settlers arrived in Ardoch, the stability of the Algonquin culture had already been under threat for 250 years. Trade, wars, epidemics, and finally ecological devastation had disrupted their relationships with the land, with themselves and their indigenous neighbors. The Ardoch area, near the height of land, had become a refuge for a disparate collection of local and related indigenous families in what had once been a winter hunting territory of 3 or 4 extended families. This map will help us understand the indigenous Algonquin economy and lifestyle before European contact. Algonquins had 250 plants that they could use for food and others that they could use for medicine. That's deep knowledge. They also had a deep knowledge of the animals and the fish that they hunted and sought. And so they had an extensive diet based within the local indigenous ecosystems. And because of that, they needed large territories in order to forage. Large territories require that areas be broken up into sections that can reseed or regrow over a period of time before they're hunted again. The dotted dark brown lines, represent the height of land. And the height of land is the separation between one group, for instance, the Mississaugas on the browner section and the Algonquins on the green section. And the green lines represent the divisions between family hunting territories, particularly winter hunting territories. And then the small, or the lighter blue lines in between the green encircled lines, hunting territory would be divided into quadrants, where one year one area would be hunted and plants would be harvested. In the next year the family would move to another quadrant. In the 3rd year, again another quadrant, and the 4th year another. And that way that would allow for the regeneration of the resources that they depended upon. In this map, there's a river that runs up through the between 2 hunting territories. You notice that there's a large blue splotch there that represents a lake. Now, there could be wild rice in that lake, and so when people arrived in their hunting territories in the fall, they would harvest that wild rice. But it wasn't exclusive just to those 2 families, and they didn't divide the lake in 2 as there might have been on one side or the other. they actually shared that wild rice with themselves and also with other families from other territories. In fact, they would even share it with the Mississaugas on the other side of the height of land because there was likely an abundance of wild rice, and it was a very important staple for getting people through the hard winters. They may go to the rapids in the springtime, and even though the rapids lie clearly within one quadrant of one family's winter hunting territory, the rapids would attract people from other hunting territories, and again, there would be a sharing of the resource and the labor in taking the fish at the rapids at that particular time. So, reciprocity, the sharing of space, the sharing of resources, and a sense of stewardship over certain areas of land, but not strict ownership. Now, groups shared available resources. Height of land served as the natural boundary, although indigenous societies practiced exogamy to secure compatible relations and establish defensive allies. It was important for the Algonquins and the Mississaugas to get along. So from time to time, a family that got along knew each other and believed that the attributes of a man and woman would be good together and that it would ensure survival for the family, both families. Then a marriage would be arranged for the two prospective matrimonials. So in that way, they also were able to keep a sense of peace. So if you were traveling on one side of the height of land and someone said, "What are you doing here?" Well, you could say, "Well, I'm here to visit my cousin. I'm here to visit my sister." And in that way, families became integrated, even though they had different territories and different demarcations on their traditional lands. The merging of the settler and Algonquin people developed a strict class system in which the Indian became the servant. Women washed clothes, cooked and cleaned in the labor camps and private homes. They sold handmade baskets and small game door to door. Men hunted and guided. When wage labor was available, they were the last to be hired and the first to be fired. World War I came and went, and afterwards left the Algonquin women almost entirely on their own when husbands died in the fields of France. There was a mixing of peoples. That was inevitable under these conditions, but the divisions continued. In the first half of the 20th century, the Lands and Forest Department burned the homes of Indian squatters, and the Child Welfare Department rounded up children and indentured them to work on farms around Kingston and Amherst Island. Ardoch settlers went through a boom and bust. The population grew and declined. Centered around its post office and general store, Ardoch had become a tourist destination for sports fishermen and seasonal cottage owners. People still labored in the same marginal economy, and eventually the strict lines between Indians and settlers had begun to fade. By the time of the Rice War in 1981, there had been little change except for a new bridge over the Mississippi. On a sunny morning in early September 1979, a strange noise came from the lake. At first, it sounded like a helicopter. When the noise persisted, local residents went to investigate and found the mechanical rice harvester combing the rice beds. Howard Hermer, a non-Indian resident, attempted to arrest the operator for stealing the Indians' rice. The young man in the rice boat told him to phone the district office of the Ministry of Natural Resources to confirm that he had a legal permit to the entire rice crop. The threat to the wild rice at Ardoch came as a surprise. That season, Lanark Wild Rice Incorporated got the entire crop. To say the least, no one was happy that outsiders were taking what people believed was theirs, or at least belonged to their Indians. It is important to recognize that from the start, a variety of cultural inheritances were intersecting. For the settlers, there was a long, dormant anxiety of being forced from ancestral lands themselves and exploited in the acquisition of colonial domination by an elite class. Even their proud settler patriotism was shaken, and an ancient spirit of rebellion was ignited. For the Indians, it was the last bit of culture that tied them to their ancestors and fostered a value system which still held what was left of their ancestral ways of being. Of course, there were others involved. Lanark Wild Rice Incorporated had visions of entrepreneurial wealth and investments made and promised. There was also the province, which had the authority over resource rights and a responsibility to encourage economic growth. The nation of Canada was currently negotiating the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution with First Nation leaders in reference to a new idea, Aboriginal rights as a form of Citizens Plus. Clearly, there was a struggle ahead, but the power differential seemed overwhelming to the folks at Ardoch. Harold Perry had next to nothing to lose because he understood that you couldn't think of things that way. If a fight was to be had, then you had to fight. Harold had been born in Ardoch, and his ancestors had brought the Minoman from Rice Lake over 100 years before. He had inherited the responsibility from his father for looking after the rice and sharing the harvest with others. As a man, as a human being, he had no choice but to fight. At the age of 14, Harold had walked to Toronto to stay with relatives and go to high school. The Toronto School Board shut him out because he was an Indian, and in their minds he should have been in a residential school. Harold applied to night school. When Harold returned to Ardoch in his early 20s, he had acquired a machinist, electrician's, and carpenter's license. He had also studied judo and gained his black belt. Now, at the age of 50, he was now required to take on a formidable and powerful establishment. Harold became a catalyst and leader for a community under siege. James Auld was the Minister of Natural Resources. He faced the threat of corporations from Manitoba taking over wild rice in northwestern Ontario, which they had already accomplished in Manitoba. In response, he had declared a 5-year moratorium on issuing harvesting licenses in Ontario. He had seen Eastern Ontario, his own stomping ground, as inconsequential to his own policy, and therefore permitted the license to Lanark Wild Rice. James Auld saw himself as a man of the people. A conservative MPP from Brockville, he had served as a minister in numerous portfolios under successive conservative governments. William Davis was the Premier of Ontario at the time. He had gained fame as the Minister of Education and was considered a progressive conservative. However, he faced uncertain economic times. Inflation was rampant. Mortgage rates had risen to 17%, and unemployment provincially was running at an all-time high. Any opportunity to encourage employment and collect resource royalties became his priority. Federally, Liberal Pierre Trudeau was on the verge of including a section on Aboriginal rights in the new Constitution. Although when asked what those rights might be, he jokingly said, "Well, we'll let the next generation fight over that." Following that summer, Harold Perry complained to the district office of the Ministry of Natural Resources. More importantly, Harold began to gather his own resources. Talking to people in the community, local municipal councils, and almost anyone else who would listen. As he identified his allies, he would visit them regularly, ask for ideas, and organizing an informed group. The story of rice became the community cause and dominated local discussions and gossip. The local pressure on the district office reached such a level that the district manager agreed to hold a meeting at Ampa Fire Hall on May 6, 1980. Over 100 residents attended, and the message was loud and clear. As a result, when Lanark Wild Rice applied for a 1980 license to harvest wild rice, the district manager declined to issue it. Lanark Wild Rice appealed to the deputy minister. The Wild Rice Harvesting Act, 1970, has provisions for an appeal under Section 3.5, stating, quote, "Before refusing to issue a license or canceling a license, the deputy minister shall cause an officer in the department to hold a hearing to which the applicant or licensee shall be a party." As a result, a hearing was called and was scheduled to take place on July 24, 1980, in order that a resolution should be found prior to the harvest period, before late August and before September. W.A. Buchan from northwestern Ontario, a conservative insider, was appointed to chair the hearing because of his, quote, "intimate knowledge of Aboriginal people and wild rice," unquote. The community was given 10 days to prepare. Lanark Wild Rice had hired a lawyer from Ottawa. The hearing was held at the Soldiers Memorial Hall in Charlotte Lake, which on any day of the week could be used for bingos, traveling movie theater, courthouse, or a dance. On the day of the hearing, the hall was packed. During the hearing, Lanark Wild Rice claimed that they would create local jobs and even build a processing plant in Ardoch. They gave evidence that commercial harvesting was more efficient and environmentally safer than traditional methods. They said that they had already obtained promises of financing to support the growth of a local industry. The local community gave evidence of the history of the rice beds and how the Perry family had originally brought it to Ardoch and cared for it over 100 years. Local folks and local politicians talked about their dependency on hunting and fishing, tourists, and how the wild rice played an important role in ecosystem stability. Finally, several Indian reserve chiefs spoke about their communities and how they came to harvest at Ardoch and what Menomin meant to cultural retention. W.A. Buchan's report to the deputy minister detailed the 2-day hearing and concluded that a license should be permitted. On receipt of the report, the deputy minister decided against Buchan's recommendations and cited the moratorium in northwestern Ontario. A license would not be awarded to Lanark Wild Rice. Indians would be allowed to take out personal permits. There was a celebration at Ardoch. But behind the scenes, Lanark Wild Rice had begun to lobby their local conservative, Douglas Wiseman, and he began to lobby the minister, James Auld. Wiseman was the MPP for Lanark Renfrew, a riding in which it is said that even a dog could win on the conservative ticket. At the time, he held the position of Minister of Government Services. This is an important note because it means that the topic of Ardoch was likely to have been discussed in cabinet meetings with James Auld and the Premier, Bill Davis. By now, the Ardoch wild rice story had gained the interest of Ottawa Valley newspapers, although after the hearing it had faded quickly. Doug Wiseman's lobbying paid off. Several days before his retirement for health reasons in November 1980, James Auld reversed the decision of his deputy minister and directed the local M&R office at Tweed to issue a 1981 license to Lanark wild rice. Mud Lake would be divided into sections, giving locals and Indians a third each, and Lanark wild rice the remaining third. The decision was to remain secret until just before the 1981 harvest to avoid the inevitable political backlash that would occur. The plan was that with the harvest imminent, people would be too preoccupied to complain loudly. In the interim, Alan Pope, an up-and-coming Northern Ontario Conservative, was appointed Minister of Natural Resources to replace James Auld. Young, outspoken, and handsome, there was talk that Alan Pope could become the next Ontario Premier when Bill Davis retired. Harold Perry discovered the change in plans when he went to Tweed to get his Indian permit to harvest wild rice in early August 1981. When Harold was informed of the Auld decision, he refused the permit. And they brought the news back to Ardoch, the bad news. After a few days' reflection, he wrote to Alan Pope, quote, "I will receive my license under protest and inform you that I intend to use whatever legal means possible to change these policies. I want you to be warned that political, public, and legal means will be brought to bear on your ministry as well as the current government in order that our heritage and rights are protected on Mud Lake." Numerous meetings began to be held in Harold's living room with community members. Before long, meetings had to move outdoors as supporters from Indian bands, local community, and reporters started to arrive in Ardoch. The rapport grew collegial among strangers and traditional adversaries, dissolving into a common cause among those who would fight back to back. To best understand how a unified force developed, we can look at the four-pronged approach. The four-pronged approach is a concerted effort to bring the elements of a good campaign together. In every community, there are people with talents, and the four-pronged approach is a way to allow for everyone with talents to bring them together and to demonstrate leadership. The four-pronged approach includes research, community education, legal action, and direct action. When these all work together, they are a formidable means of achieving your goals, particularly toward community control and community involvement. Research is extremely important because in any campaign there are a lot of unknowns. What research does is it informs people, it educates them. In the process of research at Ardoch, we needed to know more about our past. We needed to know about how the rice came to Ardoch, but we also needed to know the history of the Aboriginal people, the Algonquin people, who had used Ardoch as a hunting territory, as a place of refuge, and finally as a place in which they lived in today. So, understanding something about our cultural past was really, really important. We also needed to know about the law, the Wild Rice Harvesting Act, and all of the other contingent laws that we would need to be aware of, both to use in our favor, but also to protect us when a crunch came. Also important was to learn about the environment in which the rice grew. So we drew upon people like Alan Roy, who was the environmental manager for the Union of Ontario Indians. Alan helped Harold and I understand and be able to teach others about the rice and its biology and its function with the overall environment. This also helped us later on in a subsequent hearing regarding wild rice. The research also helps us with community education. Community education was a way in which we could disseminate all of the information that we were gathering, as well as the common knowledge of the community. It helped build community by informing everyone of a body of knowledge that was important to be held by the community. Community education started about the problems that we were facing with wild rice when people began to put up signs all over the community to let each other know how they thought and also the stand that they would be eventually taking against the government to retain our control of the wild rice. Local newspapers were also very, very helpful, and we developed a community education through press releases and a development of the ideas that we wanted to promote to a larger community outside of Ardoch and outside of the regional area. Although community education began in Harold's living room, and the signs that appeared all over Ardoch and the region, the local newspaper accounts were shared with broader news agency. After a while, the Ardoch story actually became an international event. Understanding legal action is important. Legal action is not just the work that you're going to do to protect yourself in a conflict or to represent yourself in court. Legal action also entails kind of a research about the political situation, because politicians themselves are also governed by legal documents, constitutions, and their activities are outlined and to some degree controlled by the laws and statutes of a province or a nation. Direct action is the strategic employment of confrontation or demonstration in which whole groups of people take place. In order to develop a strategic position, there were people who were willing to be spies watching the rice boat as it sat in a driveway in Perth. And there were people along the roads that would report any movement of the rice boat or police, so that we understood what might happen when Lanark Wild Rice decided to move on their license and bring the rice boat and begin to harvest at Ardoch. Direct action gave us the ability to strategically plan for the day in which the actual events of the confrontation would take place. Harold had promoted a nonviolent reaction, which meant that we would have to put our bodies on the line. And that is the front line, the determined ability of a community to stand in the way of an assault. If the context that precedes a confrontation may be long and convoluted, the actual events that change history are rather short in duration. This is exceptionally true with the actual confrontation which occurred at Mud Lake. In an article I had written for Ontario Indian after the event, the confrontation over 2 days is described in this way. A group of local men and women, including the Perry family, took the job of coordinating a 24-hour blockade of the river. Randy Smoke, vice president of Amzia, local near Gore's Landing, arrived to harvest rice and lend his efforts to the blockade. The Union of Ontario Indian staff arrived. Indian people from the southeast arrived and set up sentinel posts. Local people fed and accommodated Indians who had traveled from their various reserves. For 2 weeks through rain and bad weather, the people kept a 24-hour watch. They watched all of the areas and roads. Camps were set up along the river. There was daily reconnaissance of the commercial operators' activities. A network of CB radios were set up to connect all access points. Regular telephone contacts were kept with observers 15 and 20 miles away. News agencies kept in daily contact, waiting for the showdown to begin. On August 29th, 2 Ontario provincial police officers in their cruisers escorted Lanark Wild Rice employees to the mechanical harvester toward Ardoch. Advance warning came down the line. Before the OPP could get within eyesight of the rice, they were stopped by a human road blockade of about 30 residents. Within 20 minutes, the police and the harvester turned and retreated. The feeling was one of triumph, but the people also knew that they had not seen the last of the Lanark Wild Rice Company or the police. I was there that day, and I remember standing beside the road after they left. When they left, when the police cruisers and the wild rice harvester left, people jumped in their cars and trucks and they chased them down the road. I stood there in the empty road and looked around. It was a kind of a lonely feeling, a feeling that what had happened was important, but its meaning was still rather hidden. Sunday morning, August 30th, dawned bright and clear. There was a touch of autumn in the air. The exhausted, sleepy people who had been part of the night watches milled around while anticipation played across the faces of their reinforcements. Over the crackle of a CB radio in a pickup truck came a report that 5 police cruisers were advancing toward the west end of the lake near Ardoch. A telephone message was received. 22 cruisers, paddy wagons, tow trucks, and a rice harvester were approaching from the east. Human roadblocks were stationed at both ends of the only access road to the lake. Within minutes, the cruisers rammed through the roadblock at the east end of the road. Those who refused to move were bumped and pushed out of the way. The police set up their own roadblocks and refused these people access to the lakeside. 2 OPP helicopters hovered over the lake. Back in Ampa, the OPP invaded the local community hall and evicted members of the local Conservation Association meeting. The hall was turned into a command post. During the initial stages of the raid, a number of people made their way over the water and through the bush to the lakeside, where they surrounded the harvester and the forward command post of the OPP. 8 boatloads of conservation officers arrived. Before the mechanical harvester could be unloaded, the police were informed that they would be violating private property if they attempted to launch the commercial airboat. The problem was a cottager nearby said that he owned the property all the way down to the lake. In those days, a road allowance was 40 feet, which meant that from the center of the road, there had to be at least 20 feet between the center of the road and the lake. That would eliminate any private property. This was a time when Canada had just recently converted from the imperial system of measurement to metric, and nobody really knew how to do the conversion. The forward command leader radioed for instruction and was informed that he would have to seek out the narrowest strip of land between the road and the high water level, which is public property and known as road access, approximately 10 feet on each side of the paved road. Several Indians and settlers followed the police and commercial harvester as they attempted to measure. Other Indians and settlers took to the water and set up a final blockade. The narrowest spot was found and a tape measure was brought out. It read 7 meters. The police officer converted it to 19 feet. That meant that there was clearly no private property. I was there. I was part of the measurement. In fact, we walked back to report it to the forward command post, and I insisted that the commanding officer have someone with a calculator, and in those days calculators were pretty rare, but the OPP had them. I insisted that it be done that the conversion be done on a calculator. The command officer radioed for a mechanical calculation. The word came back, 23 feet. Within minutes, the police realized that they did not have permission to cross the private property. A non-Indian settler, a cottage owner, had stepped in to stop the airboat from going onto the lake. At that point, people realized that the OPP would have to be in retreat. Leaders began to tell people, you can curse, you can swear, you can yell at them all you want as they pull out, but don't pick up a stick, don't pick up a rock, don't show any aggression, because that will turn this situation into a very ugly event. They slowly packed up. They were able to maneuver and turn their vehicles around, and they left, and the people cheered. We chased them all the way down to the iron bridge, and as they passed over the iron bridge, we stopped and set up another defensive place, because the rumor was that they would come back up through the lake, up through the river again, and over the rapids, and then into the lake again. We waited a number of hours and eventually realized that the OPP and the rice boat had had their chance. They had gone down to the lower part of the river to find a spot where they could launch, but it was impossible. And they packed it in and went home. The next morning we brought in backhoes and dug up both ends of the road that might provide the OPP and Lanark Wild Rice access to Mud Lake again. The road remained closed for the next 27 days until the rice harvest was complete. It was considered territory outside of provincial jurisdiction. Alan Pope, the Minister of Natural Resources, called for a meeting in Toronto on September 3rd with leaders of the uprising. The meeting was cordial, and it appeared that Alan Pope had gotten the message. He had indicated that another hearing would be held in November. He assured the people at the meeting that he would have a reply for us the following day. 2 weeks later, on September 18th, a letter arrived containing a telex he had written to the district manager at Tweed on September 4th. In it, he reiterated his position prior to the standoff. Pope reiterated that the province had the responsibility to develop wild rice for the benefit of all of the citizens of Ontario, stating he was responsible to obtain the maximum economic benefit and to guarantee a rational and responsible system to ensure a sustainable yield. Alan Pope had ignored the issue of Aboriginal rights altogether. The conflict had brought together a diverse group who shared common concerns. Taking leadership again, Harold Perry helped form an umbrella organization called the Indian, Métis, and Settlers Wild Rice Association. Known as IMSET, the new organization continued to follow the four-pronged approach in pursuing a final settlement with the province. It also included all of the participants who had been involved in the standoff. By now, Lanark Wild Rice was more or less an afterthought. A second hearing did take place on November 30th and December 1st, 1981. Lanark Wild Rice participated, but was largely overwhelmed by the response of IMSET, who now brought 2 university biologists, a sociologist, national Aboriginal leaders, ordinary folks, and a common law lawyer to give testimony. The Soldiers' Hall in Charlotte Lake had been standing room only for 2 days. After numerous letters asking for a decision on the hearing, Alan Pope, on April 20th, 1982, finally issued a press release reiterating that the M&R would divide Mud Lake into sections, guaranteeing 30% for commercial harvest. This could be read only 2 ways: an effort to save face, and the old foot-in-the-door tactic of the colonial mindset. Quote, "The Board of Directors of IMSET rejects the decision of the Honorable Alan Pope, which are contained in his correspondence of June 18, 1982, and puts him on notice that IMSET will continue to exercise its Indigenous rights and will continue to control the use of wild rice at Mud Lake, Ontario. IMSET will passively resist any force which attempts to diminish our members' rights to peacefully harvest wild rice on any part of Mud Lake. IMSET is dedicated to a strengthened union between Native and rural people to ensure that the rights of this particular resource and the accompanying cultural values and traditions will never be surrendered." IMSET began to prepare to do battle at Mud Lake for another ricing season. On August 20th, Alan Pope called for a meeting in Kingston. We met at Queen's University. 6 reserve chiefs were present, along with 2 township reeves, Harold Perry and myself. Mr. Pope was accompanied by a district director and his parliamentary aides. When we entered into the conference room and sat down, Mr. Pope spoke first. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Lovelace, I think you have been unduly provocative." My response was simply, "Thank you. Now can we get down to what we came for?" On September 3rd, 1982, Alan Pope issued a license to IMSET for all of Mud Lake. The accompanying letter stated, "I am issuing this license, recognizing that there are unsettled disputes concerning Indian rights, constitutional rights, and jurisdiction. It is agreed that neither the application for the license nor the issuance of the license will jeopardize our respective positions in the ultimate resolution of these disputes."